Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service through a unique partnership with Alaska Public Media. It is Thursday, September 22nd, 2022. And taking a look at across the country, if you'd like additional weather information, you can go to weather.gov. That is the National Weather Service's online presence, and you can point and click on this map to get forecast, watches, warnings, advisories, any relevant information for anywhere in the nation. Looking at the map this afternoon, you'll notice some red off to the far right. That's actually hurricane warnings regarding Hurricane Fiona that's impacting Bermuda. In the northern Great Lakes, the blues there indicate frost advisories and freeze warnings for areas of northern Michigan and northern Wisconsin. And then the green there in the southwest Arizona, northwest New Mexico are flood watches, as the potential exists there for flash flooding, especially in some of those Slot Canyon and other areas due to heavy rainfall. But here in Alaska, we continue to deal with the aftermath of the big Bering Sea West Coast storm late last week over the weekend. The response is in progress, recovery efforts starting soon. We have all sorts of agencies, local, state, federal, and the National Weather Service is working with them to help you in the hardest hit communities. So our thoughts are with you, and we're doing our best to provide what assistance we can to help you come through this particular disaster. But at least the good news is the weather is going to be relatively tame along the west coast coming up here through the weekend, so it'll give you a chance to begin that recovery process. In through the central and southern interior, we've seen some colder air. Snow levels have lowered a bit last night into this morning. Estradome up there around Fairbanks reported about an inch of snow. And there was also some snow up there in the upper areas of Hatcher Pass and around the higher elevations of Eureka. The main weather maker right now is a low in the western Gulf. It's going to lift up toward Prince William Sound. It's going to bring gales and some moderate to locally heavier rainfall to the northeastern Gulf and portions of the Panhandle tonight through Friday and lingering into Saturday. And then the wet pattern continues there along the northern Gulf Coast into the Panhandle later this weekend into next week. There will be a series of at least 2 or 3 more moisture feeds that are going to enhance the rainfall along that area. So really not much of a pattern change. And then, of course, today is the autumnal equinox for the northern hemisphere. That occurs at 5:04 p.m. Alaska Daylight Time late this Thursday afternoon, so about an hour before this show airs on PBS. And let's take a look at a few of the communities that were hard hit with the storm late last week and over the weekend along Norton Sound and into the lower Yukon Delta. Nome, overcast skies today, 46 degrees. At least temperatures there will remain above freezing for a while. Koyuk there toward the east end of Norton Sound, cloudy, 45. There at times have been a few light showers, but at least no heavy precipitation or high winds are anticipated at this time for the next several days. Unlikely, cloudy, 43, and then we go down toward Hooper Bay, Chivak, those areas very hard hit as well. Hint of blue sky, 46 degrees. So again, we wish everyone stay safe and the best in the recovery efforts as we continue to have a number of agencies responding to this disaster. And I just highlighted the area for special weather statement. There are no advisories, watches, or warnings currently in effect, but the areas there along the west coast surrounding Norton Sound, the southwest and north side of the Seward Peninsula and along the Chukchi Sea there in the northwest, north of Kotzebue to Point Hope could see elevated surf about a foot or two above normal high tide. We're not anticipating any major flooding or inundation problems. Just keep in mind the surf will be elevated a foot or two at high tide, so there could be some minor erosion, but nothing at all like what happened here late last week and over the weekend. And I just want to bring something else of a different flavor. Here's an update on some images from the James Webb Space Telescope. The near-infrared camera showcased. Look at this beautiful image of the planet Jupiter. The orange-yellow areas at the poles indicate auroras. And the bright white areas, including that bright white spot there, is the great red spot. Of course, we're looking at this in near infrared. And these indicate enhanced high-altitude convective cloud tops, stormy regions. And then the areas that are kind of dark ribbons that have little cloud cover, especially north of the equator. So just a remarkable image there of the planet Jupiter. Satellite imagery across the state. We have a plume of moisture down there just south of the Gulf. That's going to be the next one. It moves up into the panhandle here, especially Friday, during the day Friday. And then off to the north, there is low pressure up there along the Canadian Arctic coast. We have another low coming off of the Russian coast, Anadyr, moving out there into the Gulf of Anadyr. And that feature is going to head southeastward across the Bering and then eventually end up by Saturday afternoon just on the north side or Bering side of the Alaska Peninsula. But more importantly, the low we're watching right now in the western Gulf is going to slowly lift north-northeastward before weakening once it moves into the southeast interior. So here's the weather map. This Thursday afternoon, low pressure there in the western Gulf with another push of some moderate to locally, briefly heavier rainfall heading up there along the northeastern Gulf Coast into the Panhandle. Back to the west, fog and a little bit of lighter rain spitting at areas there along the west coast, but the heaviest winds are going to stay south of the west coast down across areas of the Aleutians. The central eastern Aleutians will see some stronger winds with the system as it works its way southeastward overnight and into the day on Friday. And by the time we get into Friday afternoon, the low is there in the Bering, situated near Nunavik Island. Again, stronger winds down there toward the central eastern Aleutians. And then we have the other low pushing up toward Prince William Sound, bringing with it some more rain there through the Panhandle by Saturday afternoon. That other low is located there on the north side of the Alaska Peninsula. And any precipitation there across interior or western areas will be pretty light, and it could include a little bit of light snow flurries there in the higher elevations of the north and interior. Friday morning lows will generally be in the 40s in the Panhandle, lower 40s, but areas could get dipped down just above freezing there in through the Copper River Basin. Temperatures Friday afternoon still could squeak out 60, lower 60s there around Craig, Klawak, Hyder, but to the west struggling to hit 50 around Anchorage, and certainly generally 40s there through the Copper River Basin, Talkeetna. And then on Saturday morning we're looking for lows generally in the 40s, mid-upper 40s there in the Panhandle. Lower 40s, some 30s though showing up once you get north of Anchorage and away from the coast. And temperatures should generally be in the 50s on Saturday across much of the region, with the warmest temperatures still back up around or tad above 60 there in the southwestern Panhandle. Low temperatures Friday morning below freezing along the Brooks Range and near freezing along the Arctic coast. The west coast around Norton Sound should generally see lows near 40 degrees. And Friday afternoon we're looking at temperatures maybe back up near 50 around Fairbanks, but 40s pretty common throughout the Yukon Valley and the Seward Peninsula, 30s North Slope and Arctic coast. Saturday morning lows again below freezing there through areas of the Brooks Range. North Slope and Arctic coast will be down near or just below freezing, and lows upper 30s to near 40 around the Seward Peninsula and surrounding Norton Sound. Saturday afternoon highs could still be up around 50 Fairbanks, especially toward Eagle and down toward Northway. Friday morning we are looking for lows to be near 40 in the interior of the southwest, and generally mid-40s extending out along the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutians. Temperatures Friday afternoon, mid-upper 40s for highs around Norton Sound in through the southwest interior, maybe squeaking out 50 at Bethel and just over 50 King Salmon, Dillingham. Saturday morning lows getting down into the mid-upper 30s in the southwest interior there, lower Yukon, lower Kuskokwim basins. Otherwise above 40, lower mid-40s across the Alaska Peninsula and into the Aleutians, with high temperatures again Saturday generally in the 40s to near 50 degrees. The 6 to 10 day temperature outlook: end of September, beginning of October, below normal temperatures across the western half of the state, mainland into through the Alaska Peninsula. Bit above normal there across parts of the Panhandle. Precipitation is expected to average above normal across the eastern third of the mainland, especially along the Alcan border down into the northeastern Gulf and in through the Panhandle, where precipitation should average a little bit on the lighter side of normal in the west.
And now, Aviation weather around Alaska.
Well, it's now time for your aviation weather. If you have a flight planned Friday or on Saturday, as we look across the mainland, pockets of IFR conditions will continue to occur along the west side of the state and through parts of the Seward Peninsula, lower Yukon, and Kuskokwim river basins, and then also along the Alaska Range, down through the Talkeetna Mountains, along the coastal mountains of the northeastern Gulf Coast, in through the Panhandle, as well as areas along the Brooks Range and up along the eastern Arctic coast. By Friday afternoon, we'll continue to watch low pressure work its way southeastward as it works its way across the eastern Bering and eventually be located to just off the north side or Bering side of the Alaska Peninsula, getting into Saturday and early Sunday. Meanwhile, low pressure will work its way along the western Gulf to just south of Prince William Sound on Friday, and with it frontal band pushing in through areas of the Panhandle and the coastal mountains there along the Gulf Coast and the inner coastal mountains there toward British Columbia there in the Panhandle, seeing IFR conditions. Also some pockets of IFR along and south of the Alaska Range and up along the Arctic coast, Utqiagvik through Kaktovik. And for Saturday morning, we expect more in the way of widespread IFR conditions there along the north slope, areas of the Arctic coast, pockets of IFR across the southwest interior and the interior of the Seward Peninsula, as well as along and south of the Alaska Range, especially down through the Talkeetna Mountains, Wrangell, Elias area, and into the inner coastal mountains there of the northern and eastern Panhandle. For Saturday afternoon, we expect IFR conditions to persist there, especially in through the mountains along the north central and northeastern Gulf Coast, intercoastal mountains of the Panhandle, up areas around White Mountains there north of Fairbanks, and up along the Brooks Range, eastern Arctic coast. And Anaktuvik Pass, generally IFR conditions are anticipated to hold Friday, as well as at Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill should generally see IFR conditions hold within the passes, though areas surrounding there may see MVFR conditions develop. Rainy Pass, IFR conditions in the morning giving way to MVFR conditions. Same thing, Windy Pass could see IFR conditions in the early part of the day giving way to MVFR conditions. Isabel going the other way, MVFR to start out Friday, giving way to IFR conditions, and especially flying south of there toward Tonita Pass, IFR conditions should hold. Mentasta Pass should generally see MVFR conditions on Friday, and then Tonita Pass, as I mentioned, generally IFR conditions are anticipated, but further south, Portage Pass should generally have MVFR conditions there. And along areas of the northern Panhandle, Chilkoot and White should generally see IFR conditions prevail throughout the day on Friday. Freezing levels are lowest across the interior, especially central, northern interior, at or below 2,000 feet aloft, with surface temperatures near freezing in the morning where skies are partly cloudy or mostly clear. We see freezing levels bump upwards of, say, 6,000 to 8,000 feet central and southern parts of the Panhandle toward Haida Gwaii, and then out extending westward from the Alaska Peninsula into the Aleutians, bumping up from 8 to 10 to even 12,000 feet aloft there over the eastern Aleutians. Greatest threat for icing on Friday will be along the Gulf Coast areas of the Panhandle, including inner channels, due to the frontal band and associated precipitation. Generally above 5,000 feet along the northern Gulf Coast and above 8,000 feet there, the south portions there of the Panhandle, and a pocket above 4,000 feet for some moderate icing possible there, especially just north of St. Paul. Upper level jet stream winds. We have a low pressure circulation there just to the west-southwest of Nunavik Island over the east-southeastern portion of the Bering. Strongest winds out over the North Pacific Gulf interface, 100 to 115 knots from the southwest. And the backside, we have 135 knot jet max to 135 knots there just to the west-southwest of the western Aleutians, bringing it down to 9,000 feet. Low pressure circulation continues there just southwest of Nunavik Island and east of St. Paul, St. George. Broad band of 40-plus knot winds over the lower Gulf, North Pacific, and then northwest winds there across the western half of the Aleutians, 60 to 65 knots. 3,000 feet, we see that vertically stacked system, low pressure circulation located off the southwest coast, southwest of Kuskokwim Bay, south of Nunavik Island. Broad winds 30 to 40 knots over the Gulf, And back out toward the central Aleutians, winds upwards to 45-50 knots out of the northwest. That'll translate to moderate turbulence, surface to 3,000 feet across much of the Aleutian chain and to the tip of the Alaska Peninsula, and then an area of surface to 6,000 foot turbulence there over portions of the Panhandle.
Greetings, fellow storytellers. Every fall, you can retell a legend in the skies of a queen, a king, a prince, a princess, two monsters, and a flying horse. Face northeast to find Queen Cassiopeia looking like a letter W. To her left are 5 stars that look like an upside-down house. That's her husband, King Cepheus. On the other side of Cassiopeia is her daughter, Andromeda. Her stars look more like a skinny letter A, and at Andromeda's feet is the squiggly constellation of Perseus the Prince, the hero of the fall sky, holding the severed head of Medusa. Facing east, now you can see what Perseus is aiming Medusa's head at, the sea monster Cetus. He's turning to stone as we speak. That leaves the flying horse Pegasus up and to the left of Cetus. All of these constellations are linked in one stellar myth, so check them out and keep looking up.
Tsunamis are a big threat not only to Alaska but around the Pacific because we have a lot of really big fault lines, and when they move in big earthquakes, they often move the water around them, and that's what causes tsunamis. I am Summer Ohlendorf, and I'm the science officer at NOAA's National Tsunami Warning Center in Palmer, Alaska. Alaska's main tsunami threat is from the subduction zone that lays along the southern end of the state. When an earthquake happens underneath the ocean at one of these subduction zones, the edge of one of the tectonic plates ends up kind of flipping up as stress is released at that plate boundary. And when it flips up, it pushes up the water that sits on top of it, and it moves a whole lot of water all at once. And that water all then becomes part of the tsunami wave. Just like when you throw a rock into a pond, you get a series of ripples that head outward from where the rock landed. Tsunami waves travel outward from the disturbance caused by the earthquake. And that means you can get multiple waves, and they're really long waves that can last for hours. Tsunami waves can be hundreds of miles long from one crest to the next crest. And that means that those crests, or the tops of the two waves, can come in 20 minutes apart to an hour apart. In the deep ocean, tsunami waves are actually usually pretty small. They can be anywhere from a few centimeters to maybe a meter, depending on how far offshore you are. As tsunami waves approach the coast, they kind of pile up on each other, and the energy gets compressed, so they grow in size and they slow down a lot as the wave is squeezed into a smaller space. If you're standing on the beach and a tsunami may be coming, you may hear strange noises like an approaching freight train. You may also see water being sucked away from the shore much further than it would for a low tide, and much faster. And sometimes you can hear things like rattling of sand and rocks. So just being alert for any strange ocean behavior and strange noises is always a good idea when you're near the coast. Most likely you're not going to see something like a huge 100-foot breaking wave as a tsunami approaches. It's probably going to look something more like a step of water that's maybe a few feet high, or just a turbulent mass of water. And it may not be very big, but it's going to be moving pretty fast, and it's going to be probably carrying a lot of debris with it. Even what we think of as small tsunamis can be really dangerous because they're associated with a lot of energy and a lot of fast-moving water. The National Tsunami Warning Center is part of NOAA and the National Weather Service. At the Tsunami Warning Center, we're monitoring streams from seismic data and sea level data 24/7 every day of the year. So the seismic data tells us how the Earth is moving, it tells us when there are earthquakes, And using that data, we can figure out where the earthquakes are, how big they are, and how deep they are, which tells us something about the tsunami hazard from those quakes. So as far as monitoring water levels, there's something called the DART system. That stands for Deep Ocean Assessment and Reporting of Tsunamis. And what those are little stations where there's a pressure sensor on the ocean floor and a buoy anchored nearby. The way it knows the difference between a normal ocean swell and a tsunami is mostly because of the wavelength. And when we look at the signal from a DART system, we can see those big long waves and distinguish them from other smaller transient waves. Our system of coastal tide gauges is also distributed worldwide and all across the ocean basins. And what these end up telling us is what the tsunami wave is doing at the coastline. We send out an information statement when there's an earthquake near one of our coastlines that doesn't pose a tsunami hazard. We also have the tsunami watch that may be issued for a faraway earthquake that has the potential to impact one of our coastlines. A tsunami warning is our most serious level, and that is the case where we would want people to evacuate from the coastline. If you hear a tsunami warning, you'll want to evacuate from that hazard zone to travel to a safe shelter, or just anywhere that's inland or higher ground outside of the hazard zone. Ahead of time, you'll want to think about where to go, what to take, and how you'll communicate with your friends and family members once you get there. It's important to remember that during a tsunami evacuation, a lot of people are going to be crowded onto the same routes trying to evacuate. During a tsunami warning, you may hear about it over the TV and radio, an alert on your cell phone. You can also see tsunami information directly on our website, www.tsunami.gov. And we're also on Facebook and Twitter, where we issue our alerts during the event.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back, and before we go into the marine weather forecast, let's quick check the sea ice edge and note that across the Arctic region, Chukchi, no ice really being reported. There's a little bit of ice trying to form way north out and through the Arctic Ocean. But we're at that point in the year where we're at minimum ice extent, and that should be officially declared within the next week or so, certainly by the time we get into early October. So I'll pass that along once I get official word of that. Looking at the southeast panhandle forecast, we have a frontal band working in with some gale force south winds. For Friday, along with more rain, winds will be upwards of 35 knots, Sitka southward with waves running 15 to 17 feet there. And the inner channels, winds out of the south 25 to 30 knots with waves of 5 to 6 feet. On Saturday, winds do come down across the region as that frontal band pushes inland and weakens. Still some lingering rain and rain showers. Southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Inner channels, waves 4 feet or so, but down there south of Ketchikan, Metlakatla at Dixon Entrance, could see some waves as high as 10, 11 feet. Outer coast, south winds 15 to as high as 20, 25 knots there west of Sitka, and waves generally running between 8 and 12 feet. On Friday, across the northwestern Gulf, winds will be westerly off the Kenai, upwards to 30 knots, even 35 knots there south of Cordova with waves of 9 to 13 feet. North winds in Prince William Sound, 20 knots, waves a few feet, and then generally west winds through the lower half of Cook Inlet and the entrance there with waves running about 6 to 7 feet. Now on Saturday, winds come down across the region as well. We're looking at generally south to southeast winds running right around 15 knots or so. Waves 3 feet within Prince William Sound, 7 feet off the Kenai, 3-4 feet within Cook Inlet. And across Kodiak Island on Friday, westerly winds 25 to 30 knots, waves 6 feet, Shelikof Strait, upwards to 10 feet as you get into the open waters there of the western Gulf. And then extending down along the Alaska Peninsula, we're looking at 25 to 30 knots southwesterly winds, 10-foot, 11-foot waves there either side there south of False Pass or north of Cold Bay. little less so up toward Bristol Bay, northwest of Port Huyton. Look for 7-foot waves, westerly winds at 20 knots. Saturday across the region there, around Prince William, around Kodiak Island, winds will be south-southwest 15 to 20 knots, and generally 20 to 25 knot west-northwest winds there across the lower area of the Alaska Peninsula, with waves running 10 feet either side there in the Bering or the North Pacific. And then within Bristol Bay, winds will be southeast 15 knots with waves maybe 5-6 feet. Strongest winds with the next low that's moving down from the northern Bering, that and toward Nunavik Island. They're going to pass through the lower Bering and especially along the north side of the central and eastern Aleutians, where 35 to 40 knot westerly gales will be in place. Waves 12 to 16 feet on the North Pacific side and as high as 15 to near 20 feet on the Bering side. Saturday, winds do come down a bit, 25 to 30 knots across much of the region, especially eastern central Aleutians. Waves generally 12 to 15 feet on the North Pacific side and 13 to 16 feet on the Bering side. Along the west coast hardest hit by last week's storm, up there through Norton Sound, lower Yukon Delta will be spared the strongest winds with the system, simply because the low is going to pass near and just southwest of Nunavik Island. So lighter winds, easterly winds 10 knots out of Norton Sound, produce a couple foot waves, variable winds there around Nunavik Island westward. But waves still could be running upwards around 10 to 13 feet, St. Matthew down towards St. Paul and St. George. Saturday, winds will be southeast 10 knots there in Norton Sound, couple of foot waves continuing, but more of a northerly wind, upwards of 20 even as high as 30 knots south of St. Lawrence down through St. Matthew and St. Paul, St. George, with waves running as high as 8 to 12 feet. Along the Arctic coast, winds will be out of the east-northeast 20 knots, waves 4 feet. And then through the lower Chukchi Sea, 25 to 30 knot northeasterly winds producing waves of 5 to as high as 8 feet off of west of Point Hope. And then on Saturday, winds will be out of the east 20 to 25 knots along the Arctic coast, waves 7 to 8 feet. Northeasterly at 25 to 30 knots across the Chukchi Sea down through the Bering Strait, waves 6 to 9 feet there in the lower Chukchi Sea and upwards to 10 feet on the north side of St. Lawrence Island. And a quick check of the weather map shows low pressure near Nunavik Island Friday afternoon, another low near Prince William Sound by Saturday. The low there will be situated just on the north side of the Alaska Peninsula, with the other low pushing inland to along the southeast Alaska interior. Thank you for watching.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.